Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to this Brussels Forum 2020. This is our fourth week of discussion virtually, and we are going to focus this week on big picture global questions of various kinds: economic, political, foreign policy, security policy. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Let me thank at the outset our Brussels Forum partners, our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all of our associate and supporting and knowledge partners. We're really very grateful to all of you. We started working on this Brussels Forum agenda some time ago, as you can imagine, a year ago, and long before anybody had thought of a COVID-19 crisis. And even at that point, we thought it was essential to have on the agenda a discussion about the future of capitalism. And obviously, this question has taken on increased importance in the light of what is facing us today, both in health and economic terms. So we're very pleased to be able to have this conversation. It's an important one for us. We're also really delighted that we have, as part of this group, and we have a very distinguished group to join this discussion today, and I'll let our moderator introduce them in a moment, but we're very pleased to have several of our key substantive partners as part of this conversation today and other work that GMF does, and so a special welcome to them. We're delighted to have our longtime GMF and Brussels Forum friend, Nina dos Santos, with us to moderate this conversation today. And Nina, with that, let me turn it over to you and thank you all for joining. Nina, all yours.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's such a pleasure to be here yet again, this time for a virtual GMF. I find that, as many of you longtime GMF participants probably agree, these are discussions that are invaluable, particularly at a time like this. And we're here today to tackle one of the hardest subjects that the world does need to tackle in the wake of this. The big question is, can capitalism survive the current coronavirus crisis? Namely, what we're going to do over the next hour is take a look at the world economy as it stands now, where it's likely to stand in the next 18 to 24 months, and figure out how radically the coronavirus will reshape our world from here to come. Now, just a few sobering statistics before I head into the discussion with our eminent four panelists, who I'll introduce in a second. Figure this, as many of you probably already know, 45 million Americans in the world's biggest market, the world's biggest economy, the biggest bastion of capitalism anywhere in the world, have lost their jobs over just the last 3 months alone. And here in Europe, and in particular in the Eurozone, the other side of the channel, because I'm in London, business activity has had its biggest, sharpest slump since World War II. If you factor in the fact that the World Bank recently predicted that what we could be dealing with is the sharpest drop in per capita income since 1870. That's, by the way, when Queen Victoria was on the throne, about 2 miles down the road from where I am now here in central London. That really puts things into perspective. We're dealing with one of the biggest potential economic crises that many, many generations have dealt with. Certainly one that maybe even our grandparents, if mine were alive today, wouldn't even remember. So the question here is, when will we be able to catch the knife, and how far will it fall? Also, how deep will it cut? Let me introduce our panelists in no particular order. Very well-known people who have reams of expertise on this subject, starting out with Kalish, who's the chief economist at Deloitte. Adam Posen is also joining us, who is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Karolina Ekholm is joining us from the economics department of Stockholm University, and we also are joined by Karim Aynaoui, who's the president of the Policy Center for the New South. So experience on both sides of the Atlantic, in the developed world, in the emerging markets. Let's start out by asking each of you whether you think capitalism can survive coronavirus, yes or no, and in one sentence, why? Kalish.
Yes, I don't think we're likely to go back to socialism if that's the alternative. I think we'll continue to have a market-based economy. but it might be somewhat different. We may move in the direction of deglobalization, maybe more nationalism and isolationism and protectionism, but it will still be some form of capitalism, but it might be a bit different than what we've experienced in the last 30 years.
Adam Posen, would you agree with that statement?
I largely would. I think Ira has it right. I would go one step further and suggest that we're seeing a corrosion of globalization, that the quality of trade and commerce is getting worse, is getting more uneven. There are more holes in the network, even though in some places, including in the New South, as Karim knows, it's advancing. It's just less even in a world where the US and the major powers are behaving selfishly and short-sightedly.
Karolina Ekholm from, interestingly enough, Sweden, which is not necessarily representative of how other European countries have dealt with this coronavirus pandemic. From a European perspective, do you think that capitalism can survive worldwide, and will it be different in different countries depending on how they responded?
Sorry. Apart from coming from a country that stands out in terms of its dealing with the corona crisis, I'm also from a country that is well known for having a lot of interventions by the state in markets. And but I do believe, like the previous speakers, that capitalism or a market-based economy will survive. I mean, I think well-functioning societies will have well-functioning markets, they have a well-functioning state, and they also have a well-functioning civil society. There may be some adjustments regarding the balance of these three components. In this crisis, it has been obvious that the state has needed to step in when markets have broken down or been affected by some sort of panicking reactions. But by and large, I also believe that our market-based economies will survive.
And Karim Aynaoui, okay, let's spin the question slightly differently, in the sense that, would you agree with our previous panelists that capitalism, albeit in a different form, can survive? But then the question is also, has its value been eroded, particularly, say, in emerging markets, who've been looking to developed economies for many, many years for guidance and markets and trade?
Yes, I agree. And I think, but the question is that if you take a long-term perspective in the arc of history, capitalism or market-based economies is being challenged. Not only from an efficiency point of view, but it's been challenged also by populations, which are asking for something else, or something that is perceived as being more fair, more equal, more just. So the inner, if you wish, the substance, the deep substance of market-based economy and what comes with it in terms of social contract in society is being challenged, and it's not delivering anymore. From where I sit, meaning the African continent and the global south, I don't think there is this is a different perspective that is there, because the challenge is really how you get from, let's say, low income or middle income status to something of a higher income status. So I think the belief that market-based economy can still deliver is even stronger than in advanced economy, where the challenge I feel in societies is deeper, because there's more to lose, basically. There you would see the challenge more in rivalry of powers between China, I would say, is offering a slightly different model, and our traditional partner in the north.
Nina, can I build on something
Please.
Karim just said? I think Karim put it very well, but the flip side of that coin is, I think it's Anglo-American capitalism that will not survive, because that was sort of the linchpin banner of the hyper-financial capitalism, of to some degree laissez-faire capitalism, of we do everything right capitalism. And you can trace the global financial crisis of 2008-10 to that. And then you can trace the incompetence of the British and American national government responses. And so capitalism, just the flip side of what Karim said, that the emerging markets and developing countries may be pursuing their own capitalism without looking to the US or the UK in a way they might once have, and more worried about the US as a harmful actor than they might once have. Obviously, people
I,
always do, but even more so.
I'm very glad you jumped in at that point, Adam Posen, because obviously you occupied a crucial position on the Monetary Policy Committee in Britain. We obviously, during that point over here, were dealing with the financial crisis of 2008 and 2007. Do you think that there's an element of our economies being in denial about the difference, about the problem that we have here?
I'm very interested in what my colleagues have to say, but I certainly think so. Or rather, let's say the political class and the mainstream education is in denial. There's so much going on in the US right now about confronting the racial inequalities, which should have come up years ago and which should have come up on coronavirus alone, given the disparities in mortality and morbidity based on race. But then, of course, we have the violence of police and white militias against people of color. And so we've been in total denial. I think the big picture denial, though, which echoes some things Karolina said, is that, there's been a proposition since, say, the late 70s, early 80s, that, Europe and other softies were giving up on efficiency for the sake of welfare state. And it was a big trade-off. So you could be sympathetic, but you could see a cost. The efficiency gains on the Anglo-American side are much smaller on the ground and have been for a long time now. So that trade-off is less of a trade-off than I think people have assumed.
So please go ahead.
No, maybe I can jump in. I mean, I totally agree with that. I think that there is a significant difference between different types of societal models, even within the group of advanced economies. So you have European type of welfare states, you have the Anglo-Saxon type of more market-based societies. And I think with the kind of welfare state, and in particular the ones that we have in the Northern European region, I think there is this partly false view that these economies are highly inefficient, and that the welfare programs that we have destroy incentives for being part of the labor force and things like that, or innovation and investments. And I don't think that that is correct. I think that in these types of societies, a lot of thought has gone into constructing welfare schemes and sort of social insurance schemes that protect individuals in a way that maintain good incentives in the economy.
If I may add also,
yes.
I think I agree with Adam that there is this issue of racial disparity and overall disparity. And what's interesting to me is that you would have expected that the growth of inequality in the Anglo-American sphere would have led to more support for a European-style social democracy. Instead, what we saw is a move in the opposite direction toward more populism and nationalism. And I'm not sure where we go from here. My own hope is that what's happening now will lead us to think more deeply about how do we address the inequalities in our society without undermining the market economy, without moving toward protectionism and deglobalization, which I think will hurt the people who it's meant to help. But I'm not sure we'll move in that direction. And the danger is that we'll have more populism. And we've seen that populism emerge in both Western and Eastern Europe as well. So we may be at sort of a turning point. The other point I'd make is that when it comes to the North-South issue, there is growing influence for China and growing support for the idea that the Chinese have handled this crisis very well, and therefore maybe the Chinese model is the model that other emerging countries should emulate rather than the Anglo-American model. And perhaps that would lead more emerging countries to look for more state intervention in a sort of semi-market-based economy.
Karim, that's something that you've talked about as well in the past, isn't it?
Yes, I think these are profound changes, and maybe to build a little bit on what Adam said, I think the issue is finance. Just throw this for the discussion, but there's an issue with finance in general that has not been solved. And my perception when I look at the Moroccan economy is that we have never really fully recovered from the financial crisis, really. Morocco, if you take Morocco, is a typical middle-income country aspiring to be a higher middle-income country. Basically, we've lost 1 percentage point, 1.5 for what it's worth of potential growth, basically. We've been sort of muddling through since then, fiscal policy, trying to recover. Now comes another shock. Monetary policy as well is quite tightened, etc. So, and finance has recovered all its glory, basically. They're back. they've not paid really a high price in the end. If you look at it, there was some tough stuff at that time. But and comes this crisis, which I think is just something revealing deeper and profound trends with very strong demands from societies, and they are different in the north and in the south. In the north is, declassification of middle class because of erosions of skills, and the perception of a negative effect of globalization, basically absorbing China in the global economy and what it has meant for manufacturing activities in general. I would say, from where I sit, there is a demand of leadership. And in general, in Morocco in particular, in the Mediterranean world, but also in Africa in general, there is a natural sort of alignment with the values of, let's say, the North, to simplify our discussion. But at the same time, we don't feel that there is a strong interest, basically. It's a bizarre situation. We understand that these advanced countries are busy with themselves, looking at themselves, solving their problems, their internal challenges. But at the same time, there's rivalry happening. And so I think these are dangerous times. I mean, we've talked, we don't have time to elaborate on the multilateral and the global order, etc., and what's going on. But I think in these times, we need dialogue, more dialogue, and over communication between ourselves. And that's where our institutions, our think tanks, I think, is important to bring, platforms to have this kind of, of a very important dialogue, because uncertainty is everywhere. And for me, populism, rightist movement, etc., are just the symptom of this huge uncertainty, at the individual level. I hope this crisis has given the opportunity of people to reflect, and think and take the time, to prepare the future and to be wise in a way.
But Adam Posen, populism was a big problem way before the coronavirus crisis, wasn't it? In Western,
Sure.
in the North, so to speak, countries?
No, absolutely. And I think my colleagues and you have been right to emphasize the political aspect of this. This is not economically determined. This is about how our government structures and how our populations transmit these things. And I think Ira's point about one would have thought there should be a push after 2008, let alone now, towards greater welfare state in the US, for example, would have been key. But what we see is a bunch of people, particularly white, less educated males in the US, who are very concerned about racial ideology, identity issues, and more concerned about relative status than about well-being. And there is a well-established result in the political economy research literature about people being less generous towards the welfare states when it includes people they consider other or unworthy. Which is, of course, offensive, but is the reality. So, we can talk about capitalism surviving, not surviving. It's about what political forces come to play. And that's not just a question of whether Trump gets reelected, obviously, as you know. The other point I would make, Nina, is I think populism, to sound a bit academic, I think populism is a bit misleading because there are all kinds of populist movements out there. At Peterson Institute, we've been focusing on what we call economic nationalism, which is a particular tradition of, goes back to the 30s, goes back to the 19th century, of identifying with your majority group, with the nation, with suspicion of foreigners, suspicion of trade, suspicion of finance, some of which may be motivated from real deprivation, some of which is pure bigotry. But I think it's important to focus on that. And when you look around the world, whether it's Erdogan or Orban or Trump or Duterte or Bolsonaro or Putin, this is something which the transatlantic community has to be very concerned about.
But
And then I think also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to just add something to that question and say, and it feeds into a question that's come through on Twitter, actually, from somebody as well, talking about the dynamics of the relationship between listed companies who employ people who at a time like this may be looking back to the playbook of 2008 and think, we've got to cut costs, we've got to cut 20% of staff. Now, with the potential job losses we're seeing later on this year, and already 45 million Americans out of work so far, and a skyrocketing of the unemployment rate in just 3 months there's going to be a logjam here, isn't there? Is there a sense, do you think, among the listed company community that dynamic needs to change? That just obviously some staff are on furlough now, but that dynamic needs to change about cost cutting and cutting staff, because that could lead to a generation of people out of work.
Well, I think there's concern about that. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be the listed companies themselves that address the social issue. That's something for governments. But I mean, the danger with this crisis is that it exacerbates some of the trends we were already seeing: the income inequality, the sense of the other, the suspicion of globalization, the disruption of supply chains has already led to more protectionism. The transmission of the virus has already led to restrictions on migration. And now here in the US, we are seeing a rebound in employment, modest one, because now with the reopening of consumer-facing businesses, restaurants are hiring people, bars are hiring people, hotels. The airlines are slightly coming back, but not very much. But what we are seeing with high-frequency data is that although we're seeing a rebound both in the US and Europe in activity, it's kind of stabilizing at a level far below the normal. And so the danger here is that as we come out of the immediate crisis, as long as the virus is still out there, people and businesses will still restrict their behavior in ways that suppress activity and suppress employment. And that will mean a large number of people remaining unemployed. It will mean a lot of businesses either failing or having to dramatically restructure how they interact with the world. And I think that's likely to lead to more social problems that governments will have to address. And so we're kind of at a tipping point. Are we going to have governments that address it by moving more in the direction of a European style social democracy with more support for people, more training, retraining for people, that sort of thing? Or do we move in the direction of more populism, as you put it?
But in particular, in particular in the United States, though, this is the big issue, isn't it? Because it's the drum roll that other economies march to, if you like. It's the beat. Do you think that there's a growing realization among shareholders that they do need to move to some kind of slightly more stakeholder based form of capitalism to save capitalism itself, and that was already a discussion that was taking place well before coronavirus?
Yeah, I don't know if shareholders are recognizing that at the moment. If you look at the behavior of shares right now, there seems to be a disconnect between some of the risks to the economy and what shareholders are doing. But I think there is a recognition on the part of business leaders in many instances that we're facing what could be a long-term necessity to restructure and also to address some of the underlying inequalities in the system. But again, this is not something that's going to be addressed fully by the business community. It's something that has to be done at a government level. And I think we're now in the midst of a debate as to which direction we go to deal with that. In any event, whichever direction we go, it's probably going to mean more government intervention in the private sector, more regulation, and possibly more taxation and spending. But here in the US, we're at a turning point. We're in the midst of an election, and the outcome of that election will probably have a big impact on the policy direction we take in the next few years.
Of course. Adam Posen, how bad do you think things are going to get, given those scenarios that Ira Kalish just mentioned there?
I think Ira hit on the key point about the forecast, which is we're actually rebounding pretty quickly. Western Europe actually faster than the US in some ways. The key points are that how much we mess up the public health response limits how much full employment we can get, and how much then we have to fundamentally transform the economy if the restaurant sector or the hospitality sector or the in-person services sector fundamentally shrinks. Those are the big constraints. I'm not that worried, as painful as it is for many human beings from a forecast point of view. I'm not that worried about us recovering 80, 90% over the next few months in both, throughout the world. The issue is what happens going forward beyond that. And so, Nina, I would just emphasize, as I've been trying to in other places, that to me, the pandemic is reinforcing some bad trends that were already in place. We've already talked about economic nationalism. Another is what Larry Summers has termed secular stagnation, which is the slowdown in productivity growth and trend growth and lack of private investment. I think this makes it worse. The over-reliance on the dollar. It's a huge irony that as the US is losing faith from other people in all the ways spoken about, the Fed and the size of the US economy is still there. And as Gita Gopinath, the IMF, and others have emphasized, and Karim knows, there's a lot of problems for the rest of the world that everybody piles into the dollar whenever there's a problem. It makes things more expensive for other people, makes credit harder. So I think there are a lot of things that are being reinforced by the pandemic. Again, most of these can be ameliorated if you have political consensus, but they're hard. Secular stagnation isn't going to go away unless we have some technological breakthrough. People are not going to have an appetite for investing. International cooperation would be desperately needed to change the role of the dollar. We need it even more for climate change, and we're not getting it. So I think there's a fundamental issue, going to some of the other themes I know the Brussels Forum has spoken about, which is the need for European leadership, frankly, for a right set of values, no matter what happens in the US, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Karolina, Ekholm, would you like to come in on that point? Karolina?
Yeah, I agree, of course, with Adam's assessment, and I agree that it's a bit ironic that the dollar its central role in the international monetary system has become even stronger, although I guess that in many parts of the world, one would want to be less dependent on dollar financing. And the reason for that is, of course, that there isn't any good alternative. The euro would be the most likely alternative, but the Eurozone has its own problem, as you are all aware of. And that goes back to the previous crisis, that sort of the global financial crisis that in Europe transformed into a debt crisis in the euro area. And of course, the whole structure of the European Union is such that it's difficult to see the EU coming out as some sort of, or sort of taking the role of global leadership, and in the way that the United States used to function, but doesn't really anymore. That's a pity, but in my view, and I've been part of the whole EU negotiating machinery as when I was a state secretary in the Swedish government. I mean, there are so sort of different national interests within the European Union that it's very difficult to see how this structure would be able to take on the role of global leadership.
Can I ask you, taking into account some of these questions that are coming through on Twitter and through the GMF chat function, can I ask you where you think the debt that is being created to throw at this problem, to at the moment kind of protect these economies, as obviously they're frozen and becoming thawed, where do you think it's going to go? Is this another 2008, 2007 sovereign debt crisis, or is it looking different for the Eurozone, Karolina?
Well, I think when the euro crisis emerged at that time, I think the central bank for the euro, I mean the European Central Bank, they didn't really know what instruments they had to deal with increasing indebtedness among its member states. But over time, I think they have sort of developed tools, so they are out there scooping up government's sovereign debt in a big way. It's not completely uncontroversial, so it is contested to a certain extent. But I think the way things look like now, they are able to keep the sort of interest rates in control that would face countries such as Italy, which is very vulnerable because it has a very high debt level. So it would be vulnerable against speculation in its sovereign debt. I think the ECB can mitigate that, and it will keep interest rates very low for a long time. And when interest rates are low, well, then even a very high debt level can be sustainable. But of course, when you build up debt, you become more vulnerable. You become more vulnerable to interest rate increases somewhere along the line. But the only reason why we might have interest rate hikes along the line or in the future is if inflation starts to pick up. And of course, it might do so, but it's not what we see now. Quite the contrary. Right now, what we see is falling inflation, if anything.
Karim, I want to ask you, there's something that we haven't yet talked about, and it's globalization and this concept of sort of unwinding of the globalization. Again, another one of those trends that, as Ira and Adam were saying, has been exacerbated by the coronavirus crisis, but was already pretty much mainstream beforehand and had taken hold. How is that going to affect emerging economies? How is that going to affect economies like Morocco?
I think, thank you. I think there are two points. I think as I hear our colleagues is that there are profound structural reforms that have to be made, that have not been made actually, and that have been sort of, re-emerge with this crisis, and is being domestic agenda at the global level. I think on globalization, basically, we have absorbed China, particularly the immense increase in trade over the past 20, 30 years has been, most of it has been, a different way to produce through, a division of production around and value chains, etc., but also, of course, the integration of China. My sense is that in Africa, it's not a big issue. As you know, African countries have voted recently and they're going to implement the continental free trade zone and agreement. In general, people are more pro-trade, I would say, in Africa. They are not. I don't see this an issue at the forefront also in society, and a sort of pushback against trade as being, linked to migration issues, etc., etc. So I'm not too worried about that for Africa. I'm more, as I said before, worried about the consequences of power rivalries on Africa and something of, back to the second sort of Cold War situation, but a situation where at some point, and we've seen it in countries like Libya that are still in conflict, where there are so many foreign interventions and influences, but you can take many other examples in West Africa or in the Sahel, which is sort of worrisome. So we may have a globalization that continues on this, rivalry of powers, unlimited in a way, uncontrolled, with the, softer rules of the game and international law, while at the same time, the kind of globalization we've looked at, which was in a way didn't deliver again for everybody. That's why you have that. I think it's justified in a way because of the redistribution mechanisms and inequality that has grown, etc. And that creates, anxiety over the future. It's a big, big issue. For countries like Morocco, basically, we have traditional partners, a free trade agreement with the US, and deep engagement and agreements with the European Union, of course, and again with Africa. So I think we still there's a consensus internally that trade is beneficial, that we should continue to integrate. At one sort of caveat here is that demand for security, demand for safety from the population will push the policies in that sense, in a way that you can see in Europe, access to basic goods, for health purposes and things like that. I think the demand for security will shape, in a way, trade among friends, I would say, credible, constant, predictable friends, where we can rely in a way, rather than just, exporting portions of your production process all around. But again, this is going to be challenged by artificial intelligence, by robotics, etc. So I think we don't know in general. So, but we know where our friends, and I think that's what is important, is that we are able together to build something else and to discuss and exchange. And I think the lack of dialogue today and the sense of urgencies of our governments all around the world, sort of, roaming from one crisis to another without a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, and also sort of, being casual with our populations. I mean, Adam was mentioning very brutal, sort of social relations in so many countries that at the end it's not sustainable in a way. This is where efficiency, even you can take democracy. Democracy has to deliver. It has to be efficient at some point of time, to people. It's not just democracy for the art of democracy, or trade, sure, or globalization for the art of globalization because we believe in efficiency markets, whatever. It has to deliver to societies. So efficiency is an issue.
There's a lot to talk through there. You mentioned the point of economic protectionism in certain strategic sectors, particularly in the realm of public health. That's a hot button issue here in the UK, where I am, where the government is already contemplating putting protection measures in place for healthcare firms, something that France thwarted a takeover many years ago in the health sector as well. I want to go to Ira Kalish and just talk about what role, if any, of the multilateral economic cooperation institutions would be helpful here going forward, because we've sort of hit this coronavirus crisis at a time when there's been a dismantling in faith in these multilateral institutions like the WTO, for instance. So one of our questions that's been coming through is there any role forward, and a useful one, for things like the IMF, WTO and G20 to play in this response?
Well, certainly. Yeah, I absolutely. I think the structure that the U.S. designed over the last 70 years, for the most part, served the world well. IMF, World Bank, WTO, WHO, many others. I think the danger now, of course, has been the isolationist and protectionist bent of not only the U.S. administration, but a number of other countries around the world that evidently don't see the benefits of multilateral cooperation. Some people have seen this virus as evidence of the need for countries to go it alone. We've seen more protectionism, particularly in medical equipment and healthcare in general. My view is that this crisis has demonstrated the need for greater global cooperation. My hope is that we'll see countries do more to cooperate. I think if we have a world in which the US has withdrawn from most of these or is hostile to most of these, and a world in which the rest of the world continues to be integrated, you could wind up with a kind of bipolar or tripolar world that would be less efficient and create more risk of conflict. So I think it does make sense to utilize the existing infrastructure and improve it if necessary.
Is that what's going to happen, though?
I think we're, again, as I said earlier, I think we're at a turning point.
Yeah.
And it's, of course, the turning point here in my country, in the United States, but it's also a turning point elsewhere. You know, we've just seen Brexit. We don't know how that's going to unfold. We do see in the European Union hostility in some countries of some leaders, and the growing strength, or at least until recently, growing strength of populist movements that were anti-Euro, anti-European. So I think the Eurozone, for example, is at a turning point, whether it will become more fiscally and financially integrated or whether it will disintegrate. And then we see what's going on in Asia, where Asian countries have tried to resurrect the TPP with the CPTPP, which kind of rolls off the tongue. And then there's China with the RCEP. And that conflict too, I think, will determine kind of the structure of trade and capital movements and governance in East Asia. So in many parts of the world, we're sort of at a turning point. And I don't know what's going to be. And I think the uncertainty over that is probably having some negative impact on economic activity, certainly on investment. I hear many people in the corporate world say they really don't know what to do right now because they don't know what the world will look like a year or two from now, and that makes it difficult to make investment choices.
Adam Posen, Brexit is the elephant in the room here as well in the UK, because obviously we've got a hard deadline towards the end of the year. It could come as a sort of twin crisis, just as the economy is really in meltdown from the coronavirus crisis, particularly if there's a second wave as well. Your thoughts on that, as somebody who knows the intricacies of the British financial system and has sat through one crisis sitting around the boardroom table at something like the MPC in the Bank of England?
Yeah, thank you, Nina. I've always viewed Brexit as, in economic terms, a hugely self-inflicted wound. I've been pleasantly surprised to be wrong at how little forward-looking financial market harm there's been in terms of a sustained run on the pound or decline in British specific asset prices. But still, if you look at the authoritative, very objective work done by UK and Changing Europe, which is the think tank at King's College London that does great work on this, nonpartisan, you know, and or the reporting by Chris Giles and the FT or stuff you've looked at, you know, they've clearly thrown away numbers similar to what Karim was talking about, you know, a percent a year of growth for several years. And when you're only growing at 2%, that's a very large number. But I think the key is this political economy dynamic we keep coming back to. Does Brexit reinforce a Britain that is closed and inward and which abets racist and divisive views, that throws away the enormous role of its universities to being a magnet to the rest of the world? Does the interference with trade in the goods market or simple services of the Polish plumbers also interfere with the trade of financial services or accounting like Ira's colleagues or various kinds of consulting? And the answer is it almost certainly does, that we don't know yet how much. And then finally, go back to something Karim said, you know, the question is, how does Britain play out? Suddenly they're back to being a middle income power. And so they're like Singapore, not in the great way of being a perfect ideal capitalist little place, but in the reality of having to do a lot of economic diplomacy, because they can't count on the US, they're secondary to the US. They have frictions with Europe. If they sell out to China, their values are in trouble, like with Hong Kong. So they're going to be suddenly back in the economic diplomacy business, and I'm not sure how well that will go. It's inherently a harder hand to play.
But if you had to put money on it, if you're a betting man, do you think that the deadline is really going to be the hard deadline at the end of this year? Do you think, despite what the government says, there may end up having to be some wiggle room if the economic hit is so hard here from coronavirus before Brexit is even?
I think it would be silly for them to not take advantage of the coronavirus to give them an opt-out to just slow things down. As many people have written about and reported, the sheer administrative burden of setting up the regime, including questions of Northern Ireland and the Irish Sea, and questions of standards and customs checks and just everything, is an enormous task. And so just like any other normal person, right, you have an emergency, you should be putting your resources in the emergency, and if people are kind enough to give you an extension, you take it. So, are they going to do that? I mean, it basically comes down to, will the EU give them enough of a fig leaf politically to say, we're really out of Europe, even though we're taking an extension? And at this point, I think the Europeans will be gracious enough to do that.
Karolina, do you think there's a country in the world that is most at risk from this question of whether or not capitalism can survive the coronavirus? I mean, I'm imagining many people on this panel may say it might be the United States and therefore everybody else suffers, but is there one country in particular who you've been particularly worried about how they've been tackling this argument? And then I also want to ask you if there's something that can redeem things to a certain extent, in the sense of bringing manufacturing back. Is there something that companies have learned in terms of the supply chains and the tightness of those supply chains, given the crisis we've seen with this economy on pause for 3 months, albeit not in Sweden?
Well, difficult questions. I mean, obviously, when you think, I mean, as we have discussed before, I mean, this type of society that the United States is, to a certain degree the UK, but the UK is still sort of more European. But in the United States, this sense of not relying much on sort of government regulations and government support when it comes to social insurances. I mean, it's difficult to come away from the feeling that this is part of the problem with increased income inequality and wealth inequality that is feeding into populism and all of these things. Of course, this hasn't got very much to do with the corona crisis. It was there way before. But it's as I guess it was Ira that observed that it's, you would have thought that this would turn people towards maybe something like a European welfare state or social democratic system, but no, quite the contrary. I guess one of my sources of trying to understand US sentiments has been this American anthropologist who wrote this Stranger in Their Own Lands, and that really seem to be people who would depend on interventions by the government and by the state and the central government, federal government. But instead, they believe in two things, and that is God and the market. It's those two things. And if you look at increased income inequality, I mean, you do see significant differences when you compare some of these more welfare state-oriented European economies and more Anglo-American type of economies. So I guess the US would be still my focus country. Now the second element of your question, that was about supply chains. I mean, of course, there was a bit of a backlash regarding globalization even before the corona crisis hit, related to things like American trade policy. Of course, in Europe, we have Brexit. That is also a significant event that it runs the risk of leading to significant trade barriers between a significant European economy and the rest of Europe. And I guess the corona crisis will sort of reinforce this. Of course, a lot of companies will have reasons to review their sourcing strategies and make sure that they're not so vulnerable to countries closing down their borders, so there's not being any transportation alternatives. So that's what I would expect. Whether that leads to some sort of increased deglobalization, of course, that remains to be seen. There's
well, I'm very glad you talked about public infrastructure and transport, because that's something we haven't yet had a chance to get into. In this new era where capitalism may survive, albeit in a different format, people will be working differently for those capitalist firms. And in many cases, they'll be telecommuting. And Karolina, I'd like to ask you this and get the view of some of our other panelists as well, but that's going to change radically state spending on everything from transport, infrastructure, urbanization policies. How do you view that in, say, 10 years from now? Will cities have hollowed out? Will we see public-private partnerships for train lines going bust and having to be nationalized? What do you think in some capitalist economies?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting area, because I would expect that if and when we get control over the spreading of the virus, then there will be time for some sort of fiscal stimulus to help a proper recovery in the economy. Because right now, I don't think that, even though we've sort of seen the things bottoming out, I don't think we're in a recovery. I think we're just not in a free fall anymore. But a recovery will come at some point, and then people will look at, well, what can we do to support the recovery? And from a fiscal policy point of view, maybe the most efficient way, where you get the most bang for the buck, so to speak, is public infrastructure investments. But then what are you going to do? I mean, what should you opt for, given that maybe after this crisis there will be sort of less air transportation? People perhaps won't be so keen on expanding big city airports because they have to go to business meetings the whole time. And things like that. I mean, I think this will be a big discussion going forward. I'll be interesting to hear what the other people in the panel says about this.
Adam Posen, yes, I'd like to ask you that. And also, I noticed that there've been a couple of policy papers that your institute has written, one of them by Olivier Blanchard and Jean Pisani-Ferry, who many of us will be familiar with who are watching, who've been taking a look at how you get people and companies back into that recovery mode. They also mention this issue of having to spend, albeit differently, on the concept of urbanization and transport. And do you think that there's any sense that politicians and companies are going about it the right way at the moment? What exactly will be the steps that they'll need to do to try and get people off furloughs, incentivize companies to make it efficient financially for them to get them off furloughs, and also get people back to work and into towns as well?
Right. No, this is an incredibly rich area as a researcher, and an incredibly important area for policymakers and business decision makers, Nina, as you and Karolina rightly point out. Thank you for citing the work by Blanchard and Pisani-Ferry, which I think is an outstanding blueprint. We also, but of course, as they readily admit, it varies a lot from country to country. What they're trying to feature are some of the specific themes and trade-offs that everyone has to confront. And one of them is this recurrent issue we keep talking about of how you keep the workers tied to the jobs. Or as Bill Spriggs, the chief economist of AFL-CIO in the States, points out, how do you start treating workers as more of a fixed cost, not something which is what you cut and then substitute other things for when there's issues? And I think the part of the challenge remains, and John and Olivier talk about this, is what do you do with the sectors of the economy that have to shrink? And we don't particularly always believe in centralized planning, that we have somebody sit there and say, we need 50% fewer restaurants and 80% fewer nail salons and 20% fewer airports. At the same time, doing programs that are completely small c Catholic, ecumenical about that all sectors are the same and we decide how much funding you're going to get based on what your cash position was at the end of calendar year 2019 also seems willfully blind. So we are going to have to move into this space where policymakers are going to have to make some judgments. And the primary issue, as you've identified it, Nina, as my colleagues Blanchard and Pisani-Ferry point out, is how do you support demand without totally impeding restructuring? And one of the key things they speak about is there's a labor side, but then there's a business bankruptcy side. And I'd be interested in what Ira thinks about all this as well. There's an issue of how do you process, get the government to have some engagement so that firms that are solvent, could be viable, make it through, versus how quickly do you sort out the firms that can't make it. And we shouldn't be so horrified in the US or the UK or Western Europe to do this, because that's traditionally what industrial policy has done. When people have looked back at what were the successes, for example, of Japanese industrial policy, it wasn't the hyped, oh God, they got ahead in TVs or semiconductors. It was that they were good about shutting down old industries and getting a moderate pace of reallocation and restructuring. And to some degree, France and Germany, particularly Germany, has done some of this in, for example, the coal mining sector and certain other sectors. So this is not just a current issue, this is an ongoing issue. But what is to me unique about the pandemic is that we have potentially lasting shifts in things like you said about transport, work arrangements, real estate, consumer interactions versus the internet, that came very suddenly across a wide range of the economy. And it's very rare. I mean, you have to think about like the auto coming to replace the horse-drawn carriage in 100 years ago, 115 years ago, but that took years. This is taking a matter of months. So that to me is the challenge, and I'm afraid I don't have any good answer, but that's why I'm supporting Blanchard and Pisani-Ferry, and also our colleague Simeon Jankov's been doing some work on this in emerging markets. I'm sure Karim's team is working on this. This is the real issue going forward to me.
So I just want to add, Ira, if you could pick up on that too, but I also want to add one question to the mix, which has come through from somebody watching. What about some of the new economic policy ideas that people are talking about, like universal basic income or jobs guarantees? Could these be a solution for the future of our economic systems, they've asked?
You're muted, Ira.
There we go. Sorry, they muted me. So the goal of policy shouldn't be to protect businesses that are disrupted. It should be to protect people. So a basic income or perhaps more investment in human capital is the way to approach this. I think there are two problems. One is that we don't know whether we're going to see permanent shifts in the types of businesses that exist. If, for example, tomorrow we find there's a vaccine or a treatment that can be widely dispersed very quickly, then we may actually go back to normal very quickly. I don't think that's likely, but it's a possibility. The other possibility is that we never get a vaccine or a treatment and we have to live with this virus forever, or at least for a fairly long period of time, in which case we will see substantial disruption where we may have a much smaller restaurant industry and hotel and airline and movie theater and so on. And we may all be working from home for a long period of time. And if we do get that kind of disruption, then we don't need as much public investment in transportation infrastructure, for example. And we may see a lot of our fixed assets become worthless. A lot of office buildings and shopping centers have to be repurposed. But the more important issue is what happens to all the people. And we've already seen this massive disruption in employment where it's the lower wage, less educated people who've been massively disrupted by these businesses losing business and maybe not coming back. What's the solution to that? It seems to me then, rather than public investment in infrastructure, we have to have massive public investment in human capital. Because if we have fewer movie theaters, but we have more people watching Netflix, that means fewer people earning low wages in a movie theater and more people working in the technology space. And the only way to deal with that is to have massive investment in human capital. Even before this crisis, we had seen over a long period of time a rise in income inequality, in part because the introduction of information technology had reduced the demand for low-skilled people, and yet the composition of the labor force had not shifted commensurately. So we wound up with a shortage of skilled people and an excess supply of unskilled people, and that led to widening income disparity and the loss of job opportunities and lower labor force participation on the part of less educated people. And that in turn, I think, contributed to some of the populist resentment that we've seen in this country. So I think if anything, we need a massive investment in people rather than just public infrastructure.
While I have you on, yes, please go ahead, Karim.
If I may, I think there is a fantastic source of growth, because that's what we are talking about here, is of course decarbonizing our economies and rebuilding sort of the the basic infrastructure, being less intense and having economic growth that is less intense in fossil fuels. Another fantastic source of growth is of course Africa, and the need to to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty or low income, and the infrastructure that goes with it, that has to be made if this planet is to survive in a very reasonable way. And that means technology, and there can be a fantastic alliance between aging countries which have huge amount of savings that want to reallocate somewhere with positive returns, in countries where for the foreseeable future, if you have peace and appropriate economic policy, you can have 5-6% average growth over the next 30-40 years. Of course, it cannot be like China. It cannot be like advanced economies of today. Otherwise, the planet will not support it. It's as simple as that. But it's a fantastic opportunity in terms of solar energy, hydrogen, moving rather than neutron and LNG carriers and stuff like that. So it's a fantastic, but it has to be seen at a global level, and this is where we come back to what we initially discussed. It has to be, and I think we'll come back to international organizations and things like that. But this is for us a fun. I mean, you take an example, Morocco and the other countries in the Sahelian band in Morocco could produce 4 times the total electrical energy of the world, by covering 1/3 of the Sahelian band by solar panels, for instance, and wind turbines. I mean, there are many examples of that. You should move hydrogen through pipelines rather than move gas, etc. And it goes back to the question of how do we live together in cities. And again, here, climate should be a driving force of all that. There's no way we can continue this way. Otherwise, it's. I mean, I think this coronavirus also shown that. I mean, it was a deep breath for everybody, at our individual level, of course, but also for the planet. I mean, we've seen amazing things over the next, the past couple of weeks. So I think these are very strong lessons we should draw, and it would be a big mistake to come back to sort of business as usual.
Thank you very much, Karim, for raising that, actually, because this is what I wanted to come on to, just finally, the positives that we could take away from here. And one of the ones that I was going to come to was, in fact, climate change, because this has given everybody an opportunity to sort of put a pause button on their own lives and on carbon emissions. Morocco, I know, has been investing heavily in solar energy with a big strategy for several years, because I remember interviewing the trade and finance ministers on it many years ago. Can we just with Karolina, before we go, I just want to talk quickly about the Green New Deal in Europe, because obviously the EU has sort of spearheaded this with Ursula von der Leyen's tenure at the European Commission and made this front and center of the EU's policy. How does the coronavirus pandemic and that sort of reassessment of what big government is for, how does that affect the Green New Deal? Will it give it new thrust and new zeal, do you think? New purpose?
Well, at least it makes it somewhat easier maybe for the Commission to push through this program if they succeed in getting the member states on board with having both a facility for recovery that they are pushing for. They could use that in order to direct investments into to projects that would advance the Green Deal. Of course, there's also ongoing negotiations regarding the next long-term budget. I mean, it's not related to the Corona crisis, but the Corona crisis has, of course, meant that there are some changes into the Commission's proposals for a long-term budget, and that's also an instrument that they can use in order to push for this deal. And I think most of the member states are absolutely on board. I know that my country is, of course, very supportive of this effort. But then, of course, there are also other interests that come into play. So you still have countries that rely quite a lot on coal, for instance, and they are also suffering through the Corona crisis. And of course, they don't see why they should suffer even more just because they can't get any support for a very significant part of their economic base. So these will be negotiations, but I think overall there's a lot of support for this initiative.
So I'm aware that we need to wrap things up now, but before we go, I want to ask each of our panelists for a sort of one-liner summing up where you think the new economic dimension will be in, be it 18 months, 24 months, 10 years from now. What's the important time frame? What's your prediction? And for Ira and Adam, I want to specifically also ask you a question that somebody has been good enough to send us via Twitter, which is, which of the economic challenges that you mentioned, inequality, debt, or trade, will be the key aspect coming up in the US elections just around the corner? So starting with Ira, then Adam, Karolina, and Karim as well. Thank you.
Well, I think the key issue in the election will be inequality. I think the administration will try to make a trade. I've seen some of the ads on TV. They're talking about China, but I don't think it will be debt. I don't think voters care about it, and I don't think it's actually a very big problem. As far as where we will be in the future, the interesting thing in this crisis for me has been never have I seen a greater demand for my time and my insights. And never before have I been more uncertain as to what I can tell people. It really depends on the virus. If we get a vaccine or a treatment in the next year or two, and I hope we do, I think we can have a robust global recovery. If we don't, I think we're in for a long period of great difficulty.
Nina and everyone, thank you for having me. I think the way forward is very much what Karim and Karolina just emphasized, the opportunity for investment and growth in Africa and other underdeveloped parts of the world, but particularly Africa, and the need for spending and restructuring and incentivization to decarbonization. The third theme I would emphasize is how much the economic nationalism interferes not so much with trade, but with exchange of intellectual property, training, human capital, skilled immigration, all the business connections that go with trade that are actually far more profound, in which there's far more support across a range of countries for putting up barriers, particularly vis-a-vis China, but even between EU and US. And I think that we see that in the digital tax debate, in the privacy debate, in the discussions over vaccines. I think that that's going to be the critical policy area for economics. In terms of the election, I don't think economics matters very much, frankly. It ultimately comes down to how many white suburban women choose to say they've had enough of Trump as they did in 2018, or choose to say they don't want to support the Democrats as they did in 2016, and how effective the Republican state and government level administrators are at blocking African Americans from voting. Those are what are going to determine the election, not economics.
Point noted. Karolina?
I agree with the view of Ira, the one that he mentioned, that I expect that there will be a recovery when we get control over the virus, either because we find a vaccine or because we find effective treatment. How strong that recovery will be, I think will depend on how good policies are being pursued. It will require monetary and fiscal support in order to have a reasonably fast recovery. But at least I'm quite optimistic that we have learned our lessons from having suffered through the global financial crisis relatively recently. So I'm quite optimistic that we know roughly what kind of tools we should use, and hopefully that's the tools that we will use.
Thank you.
I think cooperation, I think, is fundamental if we are to be in a better off position and situation over the coming years. I think it's fundamental. There are so many issues and challenges that are by essence, in terms of their response or instruments, public good and commons, in a way that we cannot sort of be efficient with domestic policies. So I think this is critical that we go back to some reasons in terms of international affairs and the management of these large issues. I mean, the carbon tax will become very soon a fundamental instrument. We're not being able to implement that efficiently all around the world. There are many other examples. I think Africa should be seen as a common, given its impact, potential negative impact, or positive impact if we do things in a good way on climate, but also as a source of growth. I have one word, which is uncharted territories for monetary policy. We didn't discuss that, but once again, we have injected, there was trillions of liquidity within the economy, and I'm worried about financial stability, where it is, not worried about inflation, but asset bubbles, where it's going to end up. Big question mark. I think we're sort of playing with dangerous instruments once again. And again, I think the question Adam posed, asked about, the nature of capitalism, the nature of finance, and its capacity, and particularly an Anglo-Saxon version of it, if I may, and how it can, sort of adjust to bring also much needed leadership in coordination with others. So thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you all here from Rabat in Morocco.
Thank
Real
you very
pleasure.
much, and I'd like to
be safe. Take care of yourselves.
You too. And I'd like to thank all of our guests, Ira Kalish, the Chief Economist at Deloitte, Adam Posen, President of the Peterson Institute, of International Economics, Karolina Ekholm from the Economics Department at Stockholm University, and of course yourself, Karim Aynaoui, who is the President of the Policy Centre for the New South. And thank you very much to our audience for joining us. I appreciate you staying 15 minutes longer. I hope this discussion has proved useful, and thankfully it seems as though capitalism may just about survive, albeit in a slightly different form after the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you very much.